Digitalization has the potential of playing a transformative role in shaping inclusive growth, and India's experience offers rich insights for other developing nations. The country has leveraged technology to enhance access to essential services like education, healthcare, and financial resources, significantly empowering marginalized communities. Initiatives such as the direct benefit transfer have improved transparency and efficiency in welfare distribution, ensuring that aid reaches those in need. Additionally, the rise of mobile payment systems and online platforms has fostered entrepreneurship, allowing individuals and small businesses to thrive in a more connected economy. As we look at the experiences of countries like Egypt, it appears that while there are major initiatives to enhance digitalization in the economy, the full potential of a highly digitalized economy is yet to be realized. The Indian model illustrates how technology can bridge gaps and create opportunities for a broader segment of the population. Thus, this discussion aims to open up avenues for exploring how other developing nations can draw from these lessons to cultivate their own inclusive growth strategies. By sharing insights and experiences, we can better understand the complexities of digitalization and its impact on economic development across diverse contexts.
Good afternoon, everybody. It gives me a great pleasure to moderate the session on digitalization and inclusive growth. I would like to thank ECS for selecting this topic. This topic has not been too much discussed in Egypt, especially by non-engineer people. Actually, the panel here we have three speakers. None of them are from the engineering, have an engineering background. However, in the audience, we have so many colleagues from the engineering with engineering background. I think we'll have a nice interaction between economist and engineer. I think this is very important to have a session that talk about inclusive growth. It's not just a matter of technical issue. The issue is actually multidisciplinary, and I would like to thank ECS for bringing the topic to the table. Actually, digital transformation must be made more inclusive, and if it is meant to realize rising the SDGs, I think we need a lot of work on inclusive growth using digitalization. And I think for many countries, this is very important. And I think also that the usual way of thinking about digitalization from the business side is to start with class A and then class B and then class C and then at the end to go to the poorest community. Actually, this is really challenging. Inclusive growth is a slogan that everybody repeats, but does digitalization bring more equality or more inequality? This is a question that we need to think about. Also, is it really promising for less inequality? And what are the challenges? In our panel today, we are hosting three speakers. Actually, I'm going to just mention shortly their position, but of course, in the folder, you have the full CVs. If I go through the CVs, it will take a lot of time. We have Ms. Lorraine Porcencula. Ms. Lorraine Porcencula is the co-founder and executive director of the Data Sphere Initiative. Thank you for joining us. We have also Mr. Anirban Sharma. Mr. Anirban Sharma is Director of Digital Societies Initiative, Observer Research Foundation. He's from India, and he will bring us also the Indian perspective on digital and inclusive growth. We have also online Ms. Reem Bagash. Ms. Reem Bagash is a deputy managing director of the World Government Summit. We are happy to have you over Zoom connection, and actually we will have in this session 2 or 3 rounds of question. In the first round, it will be more of an assessment of the situation. And the second round, we will go to solution and specific suggestion. I'm sure that the diversity that we have in terms of background and speaker are coming from different countries with different expertise and experience. I think it will be very enriching for Egypt, and actually I will try with Miss Lorraine. And I would like to ask you if you can talk about the complexity of the landscape of digital transformation, and of course the data revolution that is now everybody is talking about the data revolution. And also, what are the challenges for developing countries to foster inclusive growth in this process? The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I represent the Datasphere Initiative. We are a nonprofit think tank, and our mission is to responsibly unlock the value of data for all. So inclusion is at the center of the mission that we are set out to do. And we work in 2 streams. The first one on amplifying voices, particularly the Global South, in the space of data governance. And second, also building new tools for this new space as well, such as through sandboxes and self-organizing data communities. I'll talk more about that later. But I wanted to address the question on complexity, right? Understanding and the notion of the data sphere presupposes that we live in a new space, a new economic and political and social space where we have not only to deal with data and infrastructures and algorithms, but also with new norms that come not only from state actors, public norms, but also from non-state actors in terms of private norms, in terms of those norm setters that are out in the world, developing a lot of those terms of use that we all need to sign up to when we sign up to certain services. So you have this complexity between data sets and the collection of data and technologies, norms, and also stakeholders. And the way that this field has developed, I think it's very useful to ground it in the study of complex adaptive systems, that you can't actually fully model them because they behave, that behavior is more than the sums of its parts, and it creates a whole different dynamics in it. And when that happens, you can't model with traditional ways of thinking about how those different elements interact with each other. But what you do is that you observe and you adapt and you learn throughout it. And I think it's very fitting that this particular session it's wrapping up the conference as the last session, because that complexity has been identified in all the different panels that have mentioned emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and the challenges that come from it. And so digital is really this cross-cutting field across the different sectors and policy domains that requires a new lenses, one that needs to be necessarily more holistic and more all-encompassing. But the problem is that it's often very siloed. Often it's engineers, as you mentioned, talking to themselves, or people who are around data protection talking among themselves, or around cybersecurity talking about themselves, telecom people talking among themselves as well. So having this session organized in the context of a broader conversation regarding development and inclusiveness, I think it's really key. And the potential of technology and digital transformation is huge. Just to mention a few stats, 2/3 of the population of the world is connected to the internet. Digital trade represents 1/4 of global trade flows in 2018. 2/3 of adults receive or are making mobile payments. 2/3 are connected to social media. And to mention the specific case of real-time payments in Brazil, for example, the Pix, which we'll talk later as well, there's already 93% of adults that have actually engaged in these tools. 93% of a population of a country with 162 million people, 152 are connected to this instantaneous payment system. And so the possibilities are immense for small businesses, for societies, for the governments to actually use technologies to improve and to include people in this revolution. But the imbalances also are very deep. First, in terms of connectivity, I mentioned the stats of 2/3 of the world connected. But when we look into the statistics more critically, we see that the connection is not equal. And today in this field, we actually speak about not only connectivity as a binary of either you're connected or you're not, but you speak about meaningful connectivity. So what does it mean for you to be meaningfully connected today? One, you need to have an appropriate device. If you don't have a smartphone, you're not going to engage in the digital economy the same way as someone who doesn't, right? Even the storage capacity in your phone often is impediment for you to continue engaging in certain activities online. Second, it's in terms of the size of the bandwidth. And so the quality of your connection is key. So not only in terms of how much bandwidth you have access, but also in terms of the constancy that you have, the fact that you actually have connectivity that is resilient, the frequency in which you can actually engage in this actually informs how you're meaningfully connected. And you will see differences in this meaningful connectivity, not only across countries, and that stats show very deep cleavages in terms of digital connectivities between low and middle income countries, let alone middle and advanced countries as well, but also in terms of differences within countries. So the gaps in terms of connectivity between rural and urban areas is very deep across all sorts of countries as well, in terms of what is the infrastructure that is there that allows people to engage effectively within the digital economy. And that's just to mention the first most basic divide within digital divides. The second dimension is around skills and capacity, which is required for you to actually engage in this space. And it's not only technical capacities that are needed, but a mix of them, right? In terms of foundational ones, literacy and digital literacy, very basic ones, but also technical skills and complementary skills in terms of soft skills related to entrepreneurship, being able to engage with different people. And then on the far end of those skills, you'd have really advanced skills as well in terms of how people are engaging and being able to effectively have AI-related skills. And it's interesting because the latest stats around the AI Observatory of the OECD show a huge gap in terms of not only brain drain between developed and developing countries, and that was mentioned in previous panels as well, but also in terms of gender gap and the cultural and sectorial barriers that exist in this space related to emerging technologies. The third dimension of digital device that I'd like to mention is the one on investment. It's clear with all the different indicators that we have that bulk of capital flows around technology goes to hubs in the US, Europe, and parts of Asia. such as China. And when we look into regions, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South Asia, they receive only a very small fraction of the money that is actually going for those regions. So the imbalances are very important there also in terms of investment. And then the other dimension that I wanted to talk to about is the one of data divides, which is key as an asset, an asset for the data revolution that you mentioned. And data is foundational for creating and training artificial intelligence. So what you put in is what you put out. So if we don't have access to that really foundational element that is the lifeblood of artificial intelligence, of digital economy, we won't be able to actually reach that level of development in terms of digital economy. And so the different levels of digital divides are also very important to mention, because here unpacking also gives us a sense of the nuance and the challenge in addressing that problem. The first one is in terms of access to data. Access to data is very different depending in the country that you're in. A lot of countries have a lot of data collected from them. It doesn't mean they're actually using that data to enhance inclusive growth, to inform better policies. And so having access to data that is located within commercial actors' databases and not being used to actually foster public policy objectives is crucial. The second one, as with connectivity, we need to talk also about the quality of that data that is accessed or not within countries. There's a sharp difference between the infrastructures of data and how the quality that they have within developed and developing countries as well. Between the difference of having up-to-date data sets that are very well structured, very well maintained, and very well financed as well, to the other extreme, and the reality of a lot of countries in the global south, where you have fragmented data sets, incomplete data sets, and outdated data sets that should be used to inform better public policies around health, education, infrastructures. And that's the reality, not only in low income countries, but a lot of middle income countries as well, where those data sets are extremely siloed and fragmented. Even the most basic information around an inventory of public buildings, for example, or just how do you actually ensure the interoperability and information that you require for national payment systems. And so this is a reality across many different countries. Maybe they have some data, the data that they have is not great quality. And the third level in terms of the data divide is in the lack of appropriate frameworks to govern data, be it at the local level, at the national level, but also at the international level. Still, we do not have good frameworks to govern cross-border data flows beyond what we already have regionally. Thinking about, for example, in Europe, the GDPR, in terms of how they are developing the AI Act, and how do you actually ensure that this is coherent and interoperable across different countries? Still lives a lot of countries in the developing country in a situation where they are disadvantaged in terms of negotiating their positions or asserting their rights to actually get their value out of the data revolution. I'm going to stop here. I've already spoken a lot.
Thank you very much. Actually, you raised several issues, but I would like to focus on two important issues that are very relevant to Egypt. The first one, that digitalization, to achieve inclusive growth, it cannot be the work of one ministry or two ministries. It has to be, we have to adopt a whole government approach, but also it's not only the responsibility of the government, it's also the responsibility of the private sector and civil society and the parliament. And we have many parliamentarians today. We're happy with their presence. This is the first, I think, message. The second message is related to governance. And I think the governance of this process is very important also for Egypt, and we need to think about how to do it correctly. Having said so, I think we have to move to India, and India is a very good example in adopting inclusive growth in digitalization. And actually, in 2023, when the G20 was held in India, India took the initiative for a declaration, but I will go to that later. But if you can, please explain the concept of digital public infrastructure, because digital public infrastructure is an important concept that India is successful in it. And it has been much spoken about in recent years. And if you can tell us a little about the Indian DPI experience and how it is addressing the issue of inclusive growth.
Right.
The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Osman, and a very good afternoon to my co-panelists and other colleagues here in the auditorium. Of course, at the very outset, I'd really like to thank Dr. Abla, Ms. Miral Michel, and the team at ECES for convening the Cairo Forum. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and the fact that this is my first time in Egypt, of course, makes it more so. So good afternoon once again. Dr. Osman, I'm really very happy to focus on the issue of digital public infrastructure, DPI, as we call it in India, because this really has been a major engine for digitalization and inclusive growth in the country. And as you rightly pointed out, this was a major push during India's G20 presidency last year. It was a really very important plank of discussions and activities. There was a declaration at the end of it. And all of that helped build on the momentum around DPI that had been building for the last few years anyway. And the G20 presidency allowed us to take that message to a much wider international audience, amplify the work that we had been doing and the possibilities it also holds for other countries who might want to work on DPI themselves. But I will focus on that a little later. And very recently, just 3 weeks ago, the Quad Leaders Summit was held in the US. And once again, the Quad Leaders Summit culminated in a set of quad level principles for developing and deploying DPI. Once again, an indication of the importance that is being attached to this technological innovation across the world. And the idea was that this might actually benefit the Indo-Pacific as a region. That was why the Quad Leaders Summit focused on this. But really, what exactly is DPI and what does it do? Now, broadly understood, DPI is a population scale technology system upon which our digital economy is built. But when you examine the idea more closely, you find that DPI really does three very specific things. It mediates the flow of people through digital identity, the flow of money through real-time fast payment systems, and also the flow of information through certain consent-based sharing, information sharing systems. What's important in India's case is that we actually became the first country to develop all these three foundational DPIs. So we have the Aadhaar Digital Identity Program. We have something called the Unified Payments Interface, which is our fast payment system, and also an architecture called the Data Empowerment and Protection Architecture, which focuses on consent-based sharing. Now, all of these three building blocks, when taken together, and when these three levels interact with each other, well, the outcomes of this have been an absolute game changer for the Indian digital economy. So presently, Aadhaar, our digital identity, is used by over 99.9% of India's adult population. And this also leads to certain secondary innovations. For example, Aadhaar, when used in conjunction with mobile phones and the mobile explosion in India, is being used to open bank accounts at scale, all right? And over the last few years, 530 million such bank accounts have been opened using mobile phones and digital identity. And this has allowed India to operate the world's largest financial inclusion scheme. Now, an interesting point here is that about 60% of these bank accounts that have been opened using digital identity are owned and operated independently by women. So clearly you can see, there is a major push for women's empowerment and women's financial independence and inclusion also taking place because of our digital identity program. When we come to the unified payments interface, this fast payment system, for example, India is making 280 million digital payments every day, and about 80% of them are powered by the UPI platform. DEPA has, of course, changed the way online borrowing and lending sort of operates. And this has also been very important. The concept of DPI has actually opened up the domestic private economy because powered by DPI, we have seen numerous homegrown startups flourish. I mean, there's actually a large number of multi-billion-dollar unicorns operating in India now. And these are competing with global big tech firms, American big tech firms, neck and neck. And in some cases, actually also beating them at their own game. So these global tech incumbents are facing an onslaught of competition, the kind of which that they have not really faced before. A metaphor we often use in India to describe DPIs is that of a railway track. All right, so the government has developed digital public infrastructure as a kind of railway track, and here trains are the sort of equivalent of the private sector companies, and other companies that are using this DPI infrastructure to build their applications and solutions on top of them. Right? How does this entire system really work? There are two core operating principles. One has to do with the use of open application programming interfaces or APIs. And this allows businesses of all shapes and sizes to integrate with these three foundational services that DPI offer. Without having to invest much in infrastructure themselves. And this is quite a game changer because what it means is right from the beginning, a company can actually start focusing on innovation and value-added services without actually having to invest much in infrastructure themselves. So really, the playing field has been leveled to a great extent, and companies are finding it easier to focus on niche markets right from the start of their development of business models, etc. The other core operating principle has to do with interoperability. And, DPI is allowing different kinds of companies, banking systems, digital wallets to operate seamlessly with one another, to operate interoperably with one another. And, this is great, not just for user convenience, but it also boosts competition. It jumpstarts competition because companies are no longer locked into these proprietary systems or closed networks, which have always been the USP of, let's say, the big tech way of operating. There's a much more open ability to move across systems and platforms, and this is benefiting both people and businesses. Digitalization and inclusive growth. Now the impacts of DPI have been absolutely palpable across sectors, and it's important to note that right from the beginning, digital public infrastructure has always had a very strong SDG orientation and a pro-poor orientation. One of the guiding beliefs has been that if you start catering for the bottom of the pyramid, the large mass out there, you will always find ways to tweak your solutions to adapt to more niche markets and wealthier markets. But if you start the other way around by focusing on class A and class B, as you said, sir, then it's going to be almost impossible to customize and tailor your solutions to meet the bottom of the pyramid. So India has chosen the latter approach. That has always been very clear. We will focus for the masses first, and then secondarily the more niche markets. And this has yielded strong dividends. I've spoken about cash transfers and access to finance, but health benefits are being transferred to a large bulk of our population. Educational scholarships are being made available through these bank accounts and other DPIs. It's also helping managing public payrolls by eliminating ghost workers and thus generating public servicings. And we have also, to a large extent, been able to clean up our voter registries by addressing this rather thorny issue of duplicate voters. The deduplication of voters is a problem most countries grapple with. And of course, DPI has spawned countless other innovations. One of them, and this deserves, I think, a particular mention, has to do with fintech. Today, because of digital public infrastructure in India, there are over 40 payment applications in operation in the fintech space. These are competing fiercely for market share, and as a result, quality is going up, while at the same time costs are constantly being driven down. But if you look at the hierarchy of who is leading the market, this is really quite telling. The top fintech operator in India is an Indian company called PhonePe. all right? They absolutely dominate the market. A distant second is Google Pay. And this was the first time, in 2017, that Google actually decided to design a product specifically for the Indian market because it was lured by the attractiveness of UPI. But do remember, there's a big gap between where PhonePe stands in the Indian market and where Google Pay stands. At third and fourth, you have Paytm, which is again another major Indian incumbent. This started well. It began life as a startup. It has now become one of India's most valued companies. And way below that, you have WhatsApp Pay and Amazon Pay, which are struggling to find a foothold. So this is a classic example of a technology which has actually allowed homegrown startups to flourish. All right, to the point where large transnational firms are struggling to keep up and compete in a similar way. Now, I will just come to the point about the G20 and international cooperation in a couple of minutes. So clearly, there has been, a well-demonstrated success of DPI in the last few years, and much of this has prompted certain other countries, not just in the developing South, but also in the global North, to sort of try and replicate this success and adapt and adopt DPIs. Now, this is happening in a number of different ways. India already has bilateral relationships with a number of other countries in the global South. And we're actually helping these countries develop their own DPIs, all right? So we have MOUs in place with about 10 countries. And we are giving them access to parts of our DPI technology and architecture called India Stack and helping them to build their own national digital identity systems and other DPIs. We also have an online platform called MOSIP, which stands for the Modular Open Source Identity Platform, where again, we've partnered with a different spectrum of countries, about 15 of them. And we're helping them build their national digital identity systems from scratch with the understanding that, that the rest of the DPI architecture and all these other benefits I talked about will probably flow and follow from there. But then you also have the global north. Now, interestingly, the US has shown a very strong interest in partnering with India on providing global leadership for DPI. This is noteworthy because, the US has always been historically a believer in digital private infrastructure. That has been the operating model. But it does see the clear potential of DPI as a plank for development in third countries. So the idea is that the US and India could actually cooperate, work together to roll out and support other countries with their development of DPI. The EU also has taken a somewhat mixed approach. I mean, certain European countries like Estonia, for example, have developed their own DPIs, strongly influenced in some cases by some of India's models. There are others like Germany, which is developing GovStack. Again, some elements of which share certain similarities with the Indian concept of DPI. But more broadly, Europe, again, through the EU-India Trade and Technology Council has been very, very interested in partnering with India in third countries to sort of build capacities and roll out DPI programs. The G20, gave all of this work a push. Oh, sorry, a third kind of cooperation has to do with these digital payment systems, UPI, where the unified payments interface of India is now available in about 20 other countries, and NRIs, non-resident Indians, are being able to sort of make local payments and also sort of make remittances back to India using the UPI. The G20 gave all of this a big boost, right? And it did culminate in a high-level set of principles around DPI. For the first time, what the G20 also did was it brought these 20 countries together and arrived at a common understanding and a definition of DPI. And this is important because, it is, if taken rather literally, a rather vague concept. So it was important to try and work towards what qualifies as a DPI and what doesn't. And then development efforts begin from there. Under the G20, we've also begun developing a global DPI repository. There are excellent examples of DPI from different parts of the world. It's just that some countries don't necessarily call them DPI, but then these are ideas, programs, and technologies that really do need to be shared with the world. So the idea is to consolidate all of this, put it into one place, and make it available for other countries to dip into as and when needed. And finally, of course, as I mentioned, the Quad Leaders Summit took place just 3 weeks ago. And this was a strong move to try and start popularizing the idea of DPI and what it might mean for digitalization and inclusive growth across the Indo-Pacific as a region. So I will end with that for the time being, sir, but happy to come back to any of these points later if needed.
Thank you very much. Actually, I would like to have a follow-up question on what you have said about the digital infrastructure, digital public infrastructure. Actually, in many countries, and this is also relevant to Egypt, there is a lot of investment going to physical infrastructure. And to build roads is great, to build highway is great, but at the end of the day, you cannot really do everything. And still you are selective in terms of where to build the highway. But if we go to investing in digital transformation and digital infrastructure, I think this is a different story. And definitely it will achieve the idea of inclusiveness more than physical infrastructure. And this can be also an alternative approach for many countries who are investing a lot of money in infrastructure. What is your intake on that, and how do you rate that to the Indian experience?
Oh yeah, I mean absolutely. You know, I mean there is a strong need to focus on investing in digital public infrastructure because it has the capacity to affect a larger population, really the entire population, 100% of a country's citizens, in a way that selective pieces of physical infrastructure like roads, highways, ports will never quite be able to do. So this is important. Now, the sustainability of DPIs is an important issue, and really I think so. This is also what you are driving at. So far in India, you know, I mean, DPIs have been financed by government, all right? But the question is that sustainable? So far it has been, but going forward, alternative financing mechanisms also need to be explored. You know, we need to look at the idea of privately provisioned public infrastructure, as it's called, okay, and airports are sometimes a good example of this, where, you know, air traffic, the concept of an airport is developed by a government, but you actually have a private company running it. Can something like this also be considered for DPIs to make them more financially viable in the long run? These are models that we are looking at for sure.
Okay, thank you. Let me move to the third speaker, Ms. Reem Bagash. Ms. Reem Bagash is the Deputy Managing Director of the World Governance Summit. And she has been shaping the World Governance Summit strategic and global positioning as a platform to share the future since 2016. I would like to welcome you, Ms. Bagash, and we are happy to have you. You are connecting from UAE, I guess?
Yes, that is.
Yes, nice meeting you. Ms. Bagash, actually, I would like to ask you what are the key challenges for inclusive digital growth and lessons that you have identified in your work in the World Government Summit.
Thank you, Dr. Uthman, and thank you to ECSE for actually hosting this convening. I think one of the effectively biggest struggles in digital inclusion and making sure that it's institutionalized is that one is the culture of adaptability. We had a lot of my colleagues talk about, and co-panelists have mentioned the notion of the importance of upskilling, the importance of investments. And I'd like to just tap into a few statistics that the World Government Summit, through one of its strategic global surveys, was able to identify from a government perspective. And I think these stats actually shape a lot of the conversation. So first is with the survey that was sent out to different ministers from around the world, we realized that 84% of the ministers stressed the importance of investing in technology and human capital. And we know that this is a key challenge globally. We also know from this global survey that 74% believe that the current global financial resources are insufficient for training. And this goes back to one of the big points that my co-panelists mentioned, that is currently, this is, all the financing and funding and raising of funds is predominantly on governments. And we need to look at a participatory approach where there is multiple and multidimensional financing. Another interesting stat that came out of the survey was that 60% of the global ministers confirmed that the future government models are for digital inclusion and innovation, artificial intelligence, and the whole ecosystem will depend on participatory and enabling cooperation and partnership. And with that being said, we know what the challenges are, and we know that this is something that many are worried about, and many government officials have placed this as their top priority. How do we actually overcome this? And where does the World Government Summit also play a role in this, and what we've been trying to do over the past few years? What we have done is made sure that we have had several initiatives that actually combine government best practices with the private sector and showcase them. So going back to, a lot of the Indian models that were discussed today, at the last government summit in 2024, which was earlier this year, we had an initiative launched alongside the Indian government called the Bharat Mart. And this is the complete understanding of how do we actually get different governments to work together to ensure that we are not all just working on our own processes, but rather a multidimensional and multi-collaborative approach. It is very important for us to also note that it is funding is obviously a big priority, like the stats have already said, but skills are equally important. What we have been promoting alongside our different partners and collaborators is the notion of dual investment and a dual investment approach, where it's not just the technology and investment in the technology, it's also in the investments in the upskilling. Without this dual investment, coupled with the culture of adaptability, we won't be able to achieve a lot. And we have also had something which is very interesting, and I think this is going back to what my co-panelists also raised, is the notion of open data and access models. So one of the things that was launched through the World Government Summit is something called the Government Experience Exchange Program. And we now have around 39 plus countries who are part of this ecosystem. And what it has facilitated is for models and procedures and policies to be actually shared between not just from different countries, but also now starting with different international organizations. The world is rapidly growing, and the biggest learning point for us is that with that multi-collaboration approach that we can achieve, we can actually share a lot of best practices, a lot of open models, and this will really empower the global south. There's a lot of drive in the region, and not only that, there is unlimited opportunities, also with a very young population. And I think these things need to be taken into consideration as opportunities, so that we can actually leverage off these opportunities and build on the change. In addition to, and my last point would be really talking about how we can actually create solutions for mass equality. And this goes back to what what my co-panelists from ORF has mentioned, that it is very important to have solutions which have mass value and impact. Because with the growing population, the growing needs, the growing investment demands for digital innovation, digital inclusion, it's extremely important that we think smart, we think wise, and the only way to do that is to co-collaborate, learn from the best practices, avoid mistakes, take what works for your nation, and leave the rest. But this co-collaborative approach is very important. It will speed, it will speed up everyone, not just getting up to speed, but also ensuring that we create access for all. With that, I will, take a pause and hand back over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rimagash, for your intervention, and actually for your and also for your word of wisdom that you mentioned at the end. I think that's very useful, and they are that should be considered by many developing countries. Now we are going to move to the second round, but before doing so, I will give you some insight about what's going on in Egypt in terms of digitalization. And I'm not going to talk about all the program of digitalization in Egypt because it is multifaceted. But I'm going to concentrate on a few things in the digitalization that are focusing on inclusion. Actually, I'm going to talk about one mega project which is Haya Karima, decent life. And actually, when the Decent Life project was designed, one of the components that was introduced in this project is to provide access to poor community and poor household with internet. And that was not really a very typical approach, because usually the business model for telecom Egypt, for telecom operators, is to start with class B, class A, class B, class C, and then if they have the chance to go to the real poor, they will do so. But the idea of putting the poor community and poor household at the beginning was not a typical approach, and I think that was also a component that had impacts on positive impacts on many households. Of course, it has its challenges and the issue of sustainability, and it has to go hand in hand with increasing the productivity of poor people so that they can afford to buy the service and use it later. It is a vicious circle, of course, but it has. I think it was a good approach. The second issue that I would like to mention is the vast investment that Egypt did in terms of providing digital curriculum and digital education material online for everybody without any obstacles. That is, I think, an element that will change the learning process over time. It will not, the impact will not appear in over time. It will take time. But of course, also it has to be complemented with other things. For example, we have seen in many research that teachers now are improving in terms of the quality of material that I are presenting in classes, and even in private tutoring, which is not the purpose, but this is what happened. And that in itself is okay, but still we are not reaching the stage where the students by themselves are accessing the digital material and learning and self-learning, because probably the teachers are not very happy with this part. They prefer to improve themselves, but not to get their students to get benefit from directly from the knowledge bank, etc. But they prefer to have it through their teachers so that they will benefit from it. But this is a side story. But I am just mentioning that because actually these are two things that if other conditions were applied, I think it might make a real change in the society. Having said so, we would like to move in the next part of the session from descriptive to prescriptive. Okay, then we explain the situation, but we would like to go to solutions. And just to steer the discussion, I would like to mention one of the recent report that was produced by UNDP about digitalization and inclusion. And the report, the summary of the report is saying that there is 10 steps or 10, there is a roadmap that countries has to go through it to achieve that, to achieve inclusive growth through digitalization. And I mentioned 4 categories. The first one is setting up for success. The second one is investing in infrastructure. The third one is investing in people. And the fourth one is delivering human-centered service. I think those 4 categories, of course, they have under each category a lot of details, but at least those are the four bullets or the titles that we have to keep in mind. Having said so, I would like to move to Miss Lorraine. And I know that your organization, the Data Sphere Initiative, has done a lot of work on sandboxes. Can you tell us more about this and how you think this tool could help address the challenges of answering to the complexity you mentioned in your first intervention?
Thank you so much. What are sandboxes? And I'm going to draw on the word that my co-panelists mentioned, which is adaptability and the challenge that we have to adapt. Sandboxes, if you use a very simple analogy, we've all seen kids playing the playground. It's that space where we can get dirty, we can experiment with new shapes and new forms, make mistakes, and we are in a safe space. We're in a safe space not only to ourselves, because the sand is somehow cushioning our fall, but at the same time, we're in a safe space in terms of others. And that's what that a sandbox is about. In the definition that we have in our report of 2022, which is the first report that looks into the sandboxes, is space for digital and data specifically. We define sandboxes as a space where technology and solutions can be tested in a safe space or against different regulatory frameworks. And so in that way, we categorize sandboxes in two types. The first one, operational sandboxes, and many could call this a data space as well, where you actually set aside a certain space to secure data so you can test on new technological solutions. And that very much builds into how tech companies have tested their own technologies as well, where they set aside to do tests and with particular data sets and to not actually compromise their products, which are already in the market commercially for users, etc. But you have a separate type of a sandbox as well, which is regulatory sandboxes. And interestingly, this has been the first kind of regulatory sandbox is very recent. It's less than 10 years ago. The first one was actually conducted in the Financial Conduct Authority of the UK in 2016. And it was in a space, in a moment, very recent, where the main regulator in the financial sector realized there was a rapid space of innovation around payment systems, around P2P, around cryptocurrencies, and they realized that the regulatory framework, which is very rigid in most spaces, it's extremely regulated sector, the financial sector, could not be easily changed. And so they drew from the experience of how tech is developed to see, can we build a space where we can test it out and understand what are the implications for our regulatory system as well, but in a way for you actually to build on a dialogue stream with the private sector as well. We're speaking that it's a very important actor in the emerging field of technologies and different solutions around tech. And since then, a lot of different central banks and regulators and financial sector have developed their own fintech sandboxes. In Egypt, the Central Bank of Egypt actually has a sandbox since 2019. Many other countries in Africa have it. Many countries in Latin America, across Europe, particularly in the financial sector, have developed their own sandbox. And why this is important for the conversation that we're having today, because the key word, again, is adaptability. Since then, sandboxes have been developed in other spaces around telecom, around prototyping different technology generations such as 5G and creating those spaces for testing, but also around transportation, around aviation, utilities, data governance, around privacy-enhancing technologies, around artificial intelligence. And it's interesting because we see a growth of those spaces from different regulatory authorities, really building on the experiences in the financial sector to develop their own spaces of experimentation. We see this not only at the federal level in a lot of countries, but at the municipal level as well. In the G20 meeting that we organized in Brazil, on a side event of the G20, we actually did it with the Sandbox.rio, who has their own municipal sandbox, where they're testing for different municipal applications of transportation within a sandbox as well. But also we see that this can also be developed across regions and across different jurisdictions. And this is particularly relevant for emerging technologies because now data protection officers around the world or AI officers around the world are saying, well, there are certain things that we're just not quite sure yet. So not only looking to the dimension of testing for new technologies against traditional frameworks, but also sandboxes have been used now to test new technologies against new frameworks as well. Because the truth is that in this space, there's a lot of things that we still don't know. There are a lot of ways on how to actually get from a very high level application of principles into the use cases that we're still not sure how it translates, because some of those principles, they don't necessarily match with each other. Just mentioning one example for a moment. Within the GDPR, which is the European Framework for Data Protection, there is one principle around data minimization. The EUA Act, which is the framework for artificial intelligence just recently adopted, actually calls for explainability of AI models and accountability of those models, right? Auditability of those models. And this is in contrast because for you to do that, you actually need a lot of data. You need to keep all the data so you understand how you trained your models. And then companies, entrepreneurs, startups are looking to those two things and saying, how do I conciliate those two things in terms of collecting the minimum amount of data possible and collecting a lot in terms of the life cycle of how these algorithms were created. And this is just to mention one tiny but important dilemma into how those two frameworks come in clash. And it's interesting because within the EUA Act, they actually incorporate for the first time at the European level, the notion that every single regulator in Europe until 2026 will have to have established their own regulatory frameworks. Interestingly, now they feel like they have invented regulatory sandboxes in the context of AI, but a lot of other countries are doing, including here in Egypt. And so what we have been doing is actually building on documenting and doing inventories of those sandboxes, understanding and documenting their impact, their lessons, what worked and what didn't work, so that we can actually apply this for different spaces and different fields in the different levels, both municipal, federal, and international. And the bottom line for me here is, again, that notion of addressing this complexity, right? It's the notion that we need not only a new vocabulary, new institutions, but new tools to respond to the emerging digital revolution, that we need agility in the space, that we need to think about regulation the same way that we think about tech development. Whenever we download an application on our phone, it's inconceivable to think that you're not going to have to update it at some point. And those versionings, they come very close to each other, not in how the traditional way of doing regulation is typically done, which we are used to having to update our telecom law every 20, 30 years. And now the spaces are much shorter. So we need to think about addressing those issues and thinking about solutions less in a linear fashion in terms of like, do a regulation and it's done, I'll just wait and forget, to having feedback loops of information where we test and we make mistakes, we identify the bugs and the mistakes in the software or the regulation, and then we try again. And I think this is interesting because this is an economics forum, I'm just going to say something which is key for us to really solve the puzzle that we are in the crossroads of digital transformation, which is the matter of trust that was also mentioned here before. Whenever we play whenever the prisoner's dilemma is played once, there is one outcome. And it's only when it's played several times that we actually are able to anticipate the other's behavior and have better compounded outcomes, right? And here it's the same principle. If we keep on thinking about short-term allocation and development of regulation and forgetting about it, there's only one loop in this experience, and the trust is not there. The dialogue with the private sector, be it small or big, it's just not there. The incentives are not aligned. But it's only when we play that game several times that we're actually able to build trust and anticipate behaviors and build on outcomes that are better for everyone, right? And I think ultimately what we need is to think about solutions, tools, and institutions that are prepared to align those incentives better so that we can make better decisions to improve people's lives and include them in this revolution.
Thank you very much. I have a question. Does this apply also to the private sector? And you mentioned the sandbox technique or whatever. Is it applied also to private company?
Yes. So there are different ways for you to do it. In terms of regulatory sandboxes, typically the regulator or the authority in charge calls for a cohort of companies to participate in their sandbox and test their technologies while being in dialogue with the regulatory authorities. So it's a learning process that it's very bi-directional, where they're learning from each other. The regulator learning from what's the point of that technological solution that business is trying to do. And at the same time, business understanding what's the point of that regulation that is there to begin with, what's the safeguard intended for.
Okay. Then it can contribute to governance in general.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much. As I mentioned earlier, the UNDP report was mentioning 4 categories. One of them is investing in people. And actually, as the world moves into an era, a new era probably of emerging and disruptive technologies, what from your point of view are the skills that will be needed, and how can a new generation be equipped for the future of work? And we know that a large list or a long list of jobs will disappear and new jobs will appear. And actually, what we are learning today maybe will be obsolete in the future. But what do you think? What is your insight on that, given the Indian experience and maybe other developing countries as well, in terms of the skills that we need to teach to the new generation to cope with the change that is happening in the world of work.
Right. So thank you so much, sir, for actually setting the context of this question so well. Some 20 years ago, the journalist Thomas Friedman wrote a book called The World is Flat, which I think many of us in this room may have read. And The World is Flat was really a celebration of technology enabled globalization, how tech was actually bringing the world and people closer together. And that book was really a celebration of this phenomenon and the euphoria that went with it. Now, 20 years later, we've moved into a somewhat different era of globalization. Many of the trends that Thomas Friedman talked about then are now things we take for granted completely in our everyday lives. And in fact, the word globalization itself has sort of gone out of vogue. It's not really used very much these days because we take it so much for granted. And now, we have reached a point, as you rightly pointed out, sir, where there is a genuine risk that large parts of the workforce are actually going to be put out of action and put out of work. Back in Thomas Friedman's, in the early 2000s, we didn't even have a category of technology called emerging and disruptive tech, EDTs. We do now, and this is exactly what they are doing. They are disrupting labor as we understand it. So at a time like this, it is more important than ever before to start investing in people. and building their capacities. Just last month, the head of one of India's largest technology services firms called Tata Consultancy Services put out this rather alarmist statement. He said that within 2 years, almost all call center workers in India were going to lose their jobs, and other large chunks of business process outsourcing were also going to increasingly become the province of AI, and you wouldn't really need humans in the loop anymore. This is a lot of people we are talking about, right? But this is not necessarily a bad thing, because history has also told us that when new technologies are introduced, there is for a while a great period of churn. There is a great need for reskilling and upskilling, but ultimately we always do seem to reach a newer, higher equilibrium where productivity increases, people are retrained, and they ultimately do find newer, higher jobs. In most cases, higher paying jobs than they found earlier. Now we are living through that period now, and I think we do need to sort of steer our journey through this path a little better. What's happening in India now? We do have a problem, absolutely. And I keep referring to the world as flat because that was where the first major public discussion about many of these trends began. Thomas Friedman talked about how as we neared the year 2000, the Indian services came to the attention of the world because large armies of Indian engineers were recruited to fix what was then being called the Millennium Bug or the Y2K bug. All right. And in the years that followed, India became something of a hub for tech services and IT-enabled services for the world itself. A problem that had become apparent even that early was that Indian engineers, while we have a lot of engineering institutes and colleges, they are not all employable, which means that the curriculum doesn't necessarily make them industry ready. All right. And today, we are still at a stage when we find that year after year, only about 50% of our graduates are employable. Now, that needs to improve because this has impacts on the economy, it has impacts on unemployment, joblessness, and whatnot. Recent surveys have shown that the Indian IT services find that the major barrier to higher, to their growth as they see it, has to do with talent and the talent crunch, the lack of available skill and talent. And they say that 65% of what they consider the barrier is actually attributable to this talent crunch. But this also affects our competitiveness on the world stage. Like among the G20 countries, for example, this skill gap actually poses a year-on-year growth, a growth risk of 2.3% to India's GDP. All right, so it's absolutely imperative that we course correct in terms of skilling. Now, there's a lot that's happening. In India, because we do have a very big divide between, let's say, the skilled and the unskilled. Also, this maps in some ways onto the urban-rural divide, and also the divide, Lorraine, which you talked about between parts of the country that are actually data-rich and those on the other side of the digital divide, which actually don't have very much access to data. So, we really have to work on skilling two very different constituencies here. Urban professionals, those working in higher-end white-collar jobs, and then you have others who belong to rural India, for whom digital literacy and more foundational digital skills are actually more important, right? We're actually doing a lot to try and address both because we do fully understand the scope of the problem in India. Now, the pandemic taught us how important e-learning is. Okay, I mean, online learning platforms were used, but not to that extent before COVID hit us in 2020. And after that, the value of online learning and self-paced learning has really become very evident. So what India has done is start a new program in recent years called eSkill India. And eSkill India is a major aggregator. It brings together a lot of professionally focused training platforms, online training platforms, brings them all under this umbrella. And it's also actively sourcing and devising new content for professionals, okay, to equip them better for industry. We have another mega program of this called the Desh Stack. Desh in India means country. And the Desh Stack, once again, is trying to bring together just about all the professional learning content you could have that is generated within India and make much of it available as open source content to potential learners and aspiring learners. When we come to offline and more conventional capacity building, like I said, there are two different groups we need to cater to, the more foundational and the more high end. And we do have massive projects in both. Okay, for example, efforts are underway. Sorry.
Okay, no, okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Efforts are underway, for example, to train 10 million students, offer them professional technology training. And much of this is going to focus on AI, machine learning, deep learning, and the other sort of emerging technologies we talked about. But this is where also the role of the private sector becomes so important, because in just about every country there is a skill gap. But if the task of developing curricula and developing training materials is left to public institutions of the government only, we will almost always be well behind the curve. All right. So we absolutely need more and more of these public-private partnerships in the area of skilling and skill building to make students more employable. And in India, that's happening in a big way. Just about all the big names, be it Cisco, Microsoft, Intel, LinkedIn, Meta, etc., are all partnering with the government to roll out training programs for students. Students have also made it known, and this is actually very evident through surveys, that they prefer credentials from private company. So it's important for them to have an accreditation or a certificate at the end of their course, which says certified by Microsoft. They see that as having great value in the job market. So it's imperative we do that. Now, the private sector companies are also increasingly working with technology training institutions. The IITs in India are very famous to start these incubators and labs for grooming startups, for teaching young entrepreneurs how to run businesses, etc. When we move to rural India, okay, the needs there are different. Here, the government has a different set of priorities. And unfortunately, private companies are a little less keen to get involved here. But again, they are doing that increasingly. And here, the focus needs to be on digital literacy. We have a massive program which targets people in the age group 14 to 60, for example. And the idea is to make them digitally literate, to sort of use available data, to use basic devices, to access public services through their devices. So all of this is in place. What are the big areas, that are important for the next generation in cities who are entering the white collar workforce? We've actually had a number of national level surveys, and the top areas that have emerged are absolutely AI and machine learning. You have robotics, you have big data and analytics, you have cybersecurity, the Internet of Things, and also sort of cloud processing. These are some of the big areas that have emerged from those findings. And of course, the government is working increasingly with private sector in each of these areas to roll out training programs. Something which Lorraine drew attention to was the need for soft skills as well. In a country which produces so many engineers, we often forget the value of communication, of the softer skills needed at the workplace. Leadership, empathy, the basic ability to communicate with colleagues and subordinates and others. This is not an India problem by any means. Klaus Schwab, when he wrote The Fourth Industrial Revolution, did talk about the great pace of technologies and the way tech is combining, propelling us into this new industrial revolution. But even he made that point very strongly about the need for these soft skills to go hand in hand with the harder skills and training that you need. This is very important. And the final point with which I'd like to end is, training, not just in the ability to develop technology, not just the kind of thing that engineers do, but also the need to regulate technology. So we need a new cadre of diplomats, of regulators, of policymakers who understand the technology and can regulate for it more efficiently. And this, when it comes to AI, has emerged as a bit of a problem because, we see two broad trends. When it comes to the global north, there is a clear sort of dichotomy between innovators and regulators, centers for innovation and centers for regulation. Typically, the US has always been a center for innovation. Even today, most of the world's AI innovation is actually emerging from the US. The EU, on the other hand, is seen more as a center for regulation. And it's no coincidence that the GDPR, the EU's AI Act, have all emerged from there. But this is changing, all right? I mean, there is a blurring of lines between this, what was earlier this clear-cut division. And if you look at the last Stanford University AI Index, it shows that the number of AI regulations in the US have jumped since 2016. There were only about 8 regulations there. There are close to 35 today. All right. So, regulation is on the increase there. But how effective are these regulations going to be? I mean, it is for that we need a newly trained generation of regulators and policymakers. The global south presents a dichotomy as well, and this is a slightly different kind of dichotomy. Okay, you have countries which AI regulation actually needs a very nuanced approach, okay, because there are a lot of factors to consider. But when it comes to the global south, we are seeing more and more of a dichotomy between countries that take a very hammer-like approach. I mean, it is a no to everything. And this is because not too much AI innovation is actually emerging from the global south. So we are essentially regulating for a technology that we don't understand entirely. It is not really native to us. It is a foreign technology. Okay, so there tends to be rather forbidding sets of regulations. And then you have other countries within the global south uh, who just defer the idea of regulation altogether. The idea being that, okay, look, this is not something we understand at all. Let us not regulate for it at all. Let us postpone the act of regulating altogether. Now, really, we need to find a middle path between all these different approaches, regulation, innovation, not regulating, regulating too much. And this calls for a different kind of capacity building also as we go ahead. So that is another area in which we need to invest in people strongly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's easy to talk about investing in people in developing countries,
Very good.
but to do it is a huge task. But the real problem is in the brain drain. You are investing in people, and then people can leave. But of course, this needs a whole session. We're not going to that, but I think we need to keep that in mind. I will go now to Ms. Reem Bagash. Actually, Ms. Reem, in next year in 2025, the World Government Summit will convene under the theme of shaping future government. And can you tell us more about it and how central international cooperation, you are a central international cooperation agency, is to identify innovative solution for future challenges related to emerging technologies such as AI and blockchain, and maybe any other technology would you like to mention? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Doctor. I think the World Government Summit is under the theme of shaping future governments. But with that being said, what does that actually mean? And I think if we break that down into what that actually means, you'll realize that it's actually talking about emerging technologies. It's talking about artificial intelligence, but it's also talking about how do we integrate societies with all these changes. So it's very easy to say that, we're going to have all these different technologies. But in the previous World Government Summit gathering, the CEO of NVIDIA said a very important thing and said, we need to stop focusing on just building the AI and learning how to code. Rather, we need to learn how to live with the coding. And this is imperative because this is what these innovations and conversations at the World Government Summit will tackle. It will tackle how we see the different innovations globally, whether it is from government or private sector, and there will be cross-exchange. We will also have conversations on what these future trends are going to look like. But more importantly, how do we mitigate the crises that these future trends can bring, and how can we grasp the opportunities? We do this through multiple methods. One is working very closely with all the different international organizations and leading private sector representatives in various fields, whether it's health, finance, whether it's technology in terms of emerging technology, generative AI, and so forth. And we bring the government in order to actually get this cross-sectorial, exchange in terms of best practices. This is what we put all together under one roof. We do this through having multiple forums. I will list a few relevant ones. One is in regards to government services, and this is primarily looking into how do we actually build in innovation and really build acceleration progress for government services to be deployed in different parts of the world, and we can cross-exchange best practices. The other is the future of artificial intelligence and the governance forum, which talks about the ethics behind it. And last but not least, one of the things which makes the World Government Summit a very interesting platform, which is very close to all of our hearts, is the notion of forecasting. And I think this is a very important topic because a lot of the time, especially in the global south, the conversations are, why should I be talking about, space exploration? And I need to fix things, today on ground. And this is a relevant conversation for many. The idea is not to, skip and talk about hypothetical things. The idea is, how do we bring future trends today? And how do we actually leapfrog progress? And through cross collaboration, through exchange of policy and regulation structures between different nations, we can actually achieve this. So these are the type of benefits and conversations that can really accelerate growth. And also sustainably finance these big challenges that are not a one-stop shop or a one nation goal. These have to be on a multi-lateral approach. But I will end by saying that.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rim Bagash, and I hope next time you will join us in person. But thank you very much for joining with us. Now we have only less than a minute to cope with the schedule. If there is one or two burning question, I think please mention to whom you would like to address the question. There is no question to myself, of course, because I'm the moderator. Right, we will start with Mr. Mike.
Dr. Magid, actually, it's not a rare question. It's a comment. If we're talking about digitalization, I think we've been talking for a long time about the digital literacy, because if we want to include everybody, so we need everyone to know how to deal with digitalization, not just the capacity building for the people who will work in the digitalization. Yes. It's all the people who will be using this part. And I think this could be a very big challenge for all developing countries, not just Egypt, because you mentioned, Dr. Magid, the very good two initiatives in Egypt. I can add the third, the instant payment from the Central Bank of Egypt, which is actually included a lot of people to work with the instant payment through the mobiles. But still, we have a very long way to go to be able to to go into this inclusion.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mustafa, تفضل. And then
I'd like to be the devil's advocate. What is
as usual?
What is the negative dimension of this diffusion of information technology? I'm talking about the question of control over the data. I know that India has its own system of storing the data, but other countries have to store the data with the large information technology companies. So this is doesn't this allow these companies to manipulate the data? And I think the question of manipulation has been raised during the 2016 election in the United States, that the data has been used without the consent of the people in order to support some candidates or another. So the question of control over the data at the international level, and whether there can be some misuse of this control. And the second question, the manipulation of the data for different political or commercial purposes. Okay.
Thank you.
For the two of you.
Right. You sir, please go ahead. This will be the last question. Then we'll ask speaker to comment. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I think following up on the previous question, as far as Indian scholars on the subject, they're coming with a concept of digital imperialism, where the global north, they harvest all the data in the global south. And as we sit, all the gadgets we are using, data is not in our sovereign states. It sits in California. How is the thinking? But just far beyond that, if we look at the war in Ukraine and how the Starlink is used, I don't know here. I mean, my country, our president was speaking to Elon Musk, and quite a number of African governments have already signed to the Starlink. And the implication it has, not just on war, on a number of other issues. The question of taxation, huge taxation issues. So when it comes to data and data sovereignty, to what extent are we given the division, a clear division at a global level? The Chinese have got their own. India is having its own. Russia is having its own. European Union is also talking about data sovereignty in a unique way, contrary to United States. So I think what's left is Africa is outside all these changes. So what is the thinking and the impact is going to have on ordinary Egyptian, ordinary African? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll give the speaker the chance to comment either on the question that was posed, or I will ask them also to give an advice to make digitalization more inclusive. And please allow me to reverse the order of the speaker and to start with Ms. Reem Bagash. Each speaker will have 3 minutes, no more than 3 minutes to finish in time. Ms. Reem Bagash, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Doctor. I think in terms of the question that was addressed by the audience in regards to data sovereignty, I think this is definitely a conversation that needs to be discussed on the highest levels. And I think there is also a positive approach that is happening now. Now, given that there are different areas, regions, and nations building and having conversations on this is actually a positive outlook, because we are having multiple players looking at something which we actually do not know how will react in future, in these coming years. So it's not a very clear terrain that we are on. And I think as we approach and as there are agreements between nations in terms of exchanging data, this will shape up as the years go. Yes, there are many challenges that need to be addressed, and I think it's a very important topic that you address today. So thank you for raising that. In regards to the second, which is closing off. In regards to how do we actually get the digital inclusion to be part of everyone's lives? And I think I will end by saying it is very important to think about the masses, and it is very important to have it human-centric. You can build the infrastructure, you can build all the apps in the world. If you haven't got a cultural adaptability and that notion that people will address it, and there are a lot of campaigns and communication models that are equally important to develop as counter to the actual technology itself. And that is critical. It's also important to address the different groups within a society. You have a lot who are elderly who, will not hop onto this as easy. How will you be communicating to the masses there? How will you be communicating to the youth? So I think I'm sure my co-panelists will address this from a different angle. So I want to end by saying communication of the plans of how to deploy, and even communicating things that are not yet clear is okay sometimes, just to make sure that we can actually collectively address those challenges and actually co-collaborate. And last but not least, the dual investment. It's not just about financial investment. It's really about the skilling and making sure that it's cross-sectorial. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you very much. I will go to Mr. Anirban Sharma. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So, the question about data control and data manipulation, I think I will very closely echo what Ms. Bagash just said. Data protection laws are a national affair. Okay, so I mean, every country does have its own data protection regimes. In certain cases, like the EU, which is which is a collective entity. Of course, you have the GDPR, which covers EU member states. But otherwise, most countries do have their own data laws, which they have to abide by. Okay. Now, there is obviously a strong need for, and yes, you know, in India, I think so, like you said, it does worry us that much of our data, personal data, often resides on servers that are outside the country. Now, India's position on this has actually changed a little over time. A few years ago, you know, in 2019, when Japan was president of the G20, they put forward this, well, really very progressive and forward-looking idea of data free flow with trust, DFFT. The idea was DFFT was actually going to make cross-border data flows a reality and more possible. At the time, there were 3 countries which did not come on board. India was one of them, India, South Africa, and a third. At the time, you know, we believed quite strongly in the idea of data localization. But over time, our position has changed a little. Okay, we now believe in what is called trusted geographies. So we do believe that there are certain countries that we see as allies, which are safe countries, and we can enter into certain limited kinds of data sharing agreements with them. We now have a new data protection law in place, which came out just last year. It's called the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. And this actually reflects this notion of trusted geographies. Okay, so I mean, we have moved a little closer to the idea of data, cross-border data flows, but just a little. But, you know, having said that, there are certain classes of data which we think really do need to be shared across borders, and development data is one of them. Because, you know, most of the SDGs talk about issues that are absolutely transnational and cross-border in nature. So here, certain kinds of development data around migration, health, the oceans, terrestrial issues, all of this actually needs to be shared across data. And here, across borders, and it's important that open data, to reflect, to sort of echo a point that Lorraine had made earlier, actually be made more available. You know, the idea of open data is never quite taken off in the way that it should have, all right? There is still a belief in largely closed data sets. We need more and more of these large open data sets to be made available. And, you know, I mean, this is important, not just development, for also the growth of, but also for the growth of emerging technologies like AI, which are data guzzlers. You know, you need more and more of that. So your point about Starlink, you know, I think this also has to do in some ways with the issue of cybersecurity. You know, increasingly there are large numbers of data breaches across the world, and you know the Russia-Ukraine war has seen lots of them. I think Russia knocked out UK's the Ukraine's largest telecom provider for a while, you know, towards the end, and that paralyzed services completely. So again, you know, I mean, there are international mechanisms to strengthen cybersecurity, but countries really have to implement their own national cybersecurity strategies very, very strongly to guard against these kinds of attacks. So I'll just end with that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We'll move now to Ms. Lorraine Porcincola. The floor is yours.
Thank you. My co-panelists made my job much easier in closing and answering the questions. So I'm gonna build on these, and I have 3 minutes, right? So I'm gonna have 3 recommendations or better wishes to close here my reflections on this panel. The first one is about we need to having a more nuanced conversation about data. Often we're stuck, I feel, between 2 dichotomic views from open and closed data. And in a side of open, if you just have open data without any guardrails, you see the deviations of that or the opportunities of misuse with which you spoke to. So there are real risks of simply having open data and having no guardrails around it. But on the other side, as Nirban was talking, if we have, we should close all data, we protect it, and we don't share it with the world, there is a missed opportunity there of actually using and creating value out of it. And there was a lot of the positions that from countries that actually bought into the narrative of data localization, where they felt trapped to because it's a problem of how do you actually use the opportunities of global value chains around that data on actually having the best services around how you're protecting that data as well. value chains of data are extremely complex. They start in one country, they pass through several before they are done, if they're ever done, because they keep on moving and being reused, right? And so I love the concept of talking about data sovereignty because it's so complicated, but also it can hide the real policy objectives around it in terms of what is the objective behind data sovereignty? Is it around protecting cybersecurity? There are policy instruments for that. Is it about remedies regarding competition and monopolies? Let's think about remedies regarding that. Is it the issue around driving investment on local cloud solutions? Let's think about remedies for that. But I'm afraid that putting everything under the umbrella of data sovereignty hides the actually true policy objectives behind that. And I think it can be misused as well. I wrote a whole report about that called "We Need to Talk About Data," and I also think that the concept around data self-determination or digital self-determination is a more useful one than sovereignty, which typically relies on localization. The second point is the wish for more international cooperation in this space, one that is more mission-oriented. I think it's very positive coalitions around digital public infrastructure that has been really building on the Indian leadership in this space on the G20. Anirban and I, who work together in the T20, which is the think tank engagement group in the G20, we're calling for a coalition around data through a data 20, right? Around the global compact, digital compact that was now just approved in September, United Nations General Assembly. We also are pushing for an international decade on data. So I think those kind of mission-oriented coalitions are very useful for the global South to have more voice and to build on frameworks that are more interoperable across those different jurisdictions. Because while we can advance some within our national jurisdictions, we do need more coordination across interoperability in this space. And finally, I wish for more agility so that we can be more adaptable as well as times and those different technologies emerges through different tools, through different innovation labs, through sandboxes experimentation, and that we're able to document and learn from those stories so that we can be better forecasting and being prepared for what's to come, because this is just the beginning, really. Thank you.
Thank you. As we arrive to the end of this session, I would like to thank the speakers for brilliant interventions. I think you succeeded in making a very alive, useful session. I hope everybody enjoy it and benefit from it. And at the end, I would like to thank and congratulate Dr. Abla Abdulatif and all the team of ECS for a very successful conference. Congratulations, and I hope every year we'll have something as good as that one. And now I think we end the session and we proceed to the closing session. Okay. Thank you.